Riina, non sono più solo io che parlo. Adesso è una marea. Mafia è finita.
Riina, lei può non rispondere, però se si diverte o partecipa alla corte perché si diverte o non si diverte più.
Non commento.
Questa mafia giusta e onorata che cos'è per lei?
Che cosa era?
Sì, che cos'era?
Beh, io a dire la verità, io non ho mai creduto nella Cosa Nostra.
A volte a stabilire un contatto umano con un mafioso.
Certamente, sono uomini come tutti gli altri, ma sono anche loro persone simpatiche, antipatiche, con un'anima nobile, con un'anima meno nobile, come tutti gli altri.
C'è tutta un'umanità,
C'è tutta un'umanità,
Since time immemorial, we've all been sharing stories of good versus evil, a noble hero versus villain. You've seen it in movies, right? The good guy takes on the bad guy, and justice is served in the end. But in real life, it's not that simple. Yet, when you're dealing with someone like Salvatore Riina, aka La Belva, the Beast, you can't help but describe a man who embodied the age-old archetype of a truly evil individual. And like most villain origin stories, his was a tragic one. Riina is the kind of guy who doesn't just take out his enemies, he wipes out their entire families. Violence wasn't just a tool for him, it was the only language he spoke, and he spoke it fluently. Riina didn't care about subtlety or strategy. He thrived on destruction, using fear to climb to the top of the Sicilian underworld, taking out anyone who even thought about standing up to him. A far cry from Cosa Nostra's secretive code of conduct. Judges? Gone. Politicians? Gone. Even his own allies weren't safe. If he even thought you were thinking about betraying him, bam, you're history. Think the Joker, but instead of Gotham, Sicily was his playground. But every Gotham has a dark night, and so Sicily had Giovanni Falcone, the prosecutor who stood up to the Mafia when no one else would. Falcone was Sicily's symbol of justice in a world drowning in crime. He wasn't supposed to make it in a place like Palermo, a place where kids grow up in the shadow of Cosa Nostra. But Falcone wasn't like everyone else. He didn't play by their rules. He didn't let fear win. Now, Falcone wasn't your typical hero. He wasn't flashy and didn't showboat. He wasn't the guy kicking down doors and shooting bad guys. No, he was calm, controlled, and calculated. He didn't need a cape and a mask to be a hero. He believed in one thing: justice. And he thought that even the Mafia, the untouchable Cosa Nostra, could be brought to its knees with the right plan. The problem? He wasn't just up against criminals. He was up against a system, a web of corruption that had its tentacles in everything. So, you've got two men, Giovanni Falcone, the Batman of Sicily, trying to bring order to a world that had been lawless for over a century, and Salvatore Riina, the Joker, who thrived in that lawlessness, loving every second of the chaos he unleashed, a man who created a symphony of destruction. Their paths were bound to collide. Now here's the thing, this wasn't just a battle of good versus evil, no, this was personal. Falcone grew up in the same streets as these guys. He knew their world. He went to school with the sons of mafiosi, played football with kids who'd grown up to join Cosa Nostra. But instead of becoming a part of that life, he chose to fight it, and that's what made him dangerous. Riina? He saw Falcone as a real threat, not just another prosecutor he could easily bribe or kill. This guy was different, and Riina hated that. You see, Falcone was as competent a hunter as you can imagine, yet his prey happened to be a man who could hide in plain sight. A man who could go around the streets of Sicily knowing that the amount of fear his name alone carried would petrify anyone to give him away. Falcone, much to his frustration, was fighting an uphill battle. But Riina's reign would soon be under serious threat. You see, fate would gift Falcone a secret weapon that would finally even out the playing field. So what happens when an unstoppable force, Riina's violence and chaos, meets an immovable object, Falcone's relentless pursuit of justice? Well, it's not pretty. You're about to see how far a man will go to protect his empire, and how far another man will go to tear it down. Two extremes clashing. The stakes, the soul of an entire island, the fate of the Sicilian Mafia, the most powerful criminal organization the world had ever seen. And the prize could only be for one. Only one side can be left standing. One mistake, one wrong move, and it's all over. So, who will rise and who will fall? Well, I wish this story was that simple. You see, this one doesn't end like you and I would expect. And now, it's time to take you back to where it all started. Let's begin. The tyrant dies and his rule is over. The martyr dies and his rule begins. Soren Kierkegaard. Born in 1939, Giovanni Falcone was raised in the Calza neighborhood of Palermo, a once rich aristocratic area. It had fallen into decline by the time Falcone was a boy. The grand facades were crumbling, and the streets, once lined with nobility, were now a tough working-class district near the docks. It became a part of town where more thieves and robbers lived than honest people, as described by a local mafioso. His parents, despite this, were honest and hard-working people who did their best for their 3 children, raising them up in a strict Catholic environment and instilling them with strong values from a young age. Even so, he lived alongside the brutal reality of Cosa Nostra and its violence. His peers, those he played with and went to school with, were often the children of made men, many of which would go on to become members themselves. The criminal culture permeated every aspect of Palermo life at the time, and young Falcone was well aware of it. I mean, listen to this. One boy he used to play ping pong with would later grow up and be charged with 30 years for drug trafficking, and many others for longer on even more serious charges. I was horrified by the brutality, the murders, the aggression. Cosa Nostra was like a 7-headed hydra, responsible for all the evils in the world. But he wasn't completely, encircled by criminals and their offspring. There were many kids that also came from honest, hard-working families, and one in particular would go on to fight side by side with them later on. This was Paolo Borsellino, a friend who later became a close ally in his fight against the Mafia. A brother-in-arms to Falcone, and a key figure in the coming war with the Mafia. Falcone grew up in a tough, struggling Sicily, born right at the start of the bloody Second World War. His family, like so many others, faced some rough years. But as the 40s wrapped up, Allied reconstruction money started flowing in, and the immediate shadow of the war began to lift. Sicily started changing, businesses were expanding again, and parents could finally plan for the future. Mafia men crawled out of the shadows to rebuild their empires, which had taken a hit during the Mussolini years. Crime families that had been laying low came back out to reclaim neighborhoods, restart extortion practices, and infiltrate the booming construction industry. Seeing a well-dressed made man collecting pizzo, basically extortion money, from local businesses became normal again. Falcone grew up in this mix of renewed optimism and resurgent mafia activity. A capable student, he went on to study law at the University of Palermo. This path set him up to confront not just the Mafia, but also something even darker, many of his own childhood friends and playmates. Less than 50 miles from Palermo, in the sleepy town of Corleone, another man, 8 years older than Falcone, was making a name for himself. Salvatore Riina was just starting out on his life of crime, inching his way into the Corleone Mafia, driven by a hunger for power and wealth that he had lacked in his younger years. Riina's childhood was filled with trauma, shaping his ruthless outlook on life. He was just meters away when his father and brother were killed handling an Allied bomb. By the late 1940s, he was well on his criminal path and had already been sentenced to 12 years for fatally shooting a young boy in a fight on the outskirts of Corleone. But he was out in just 6 years thanks to some influential connections made in the Sicilian prison system. Now he was running under Don Navarra, picture a classic mafia boss who carried himself like a Vito Corleone. So Riina, alongside fellow foot soldier and future boss Leggio, perfected their rackets and strategies. The tragedy in Riina's family might have pushed him towards crime to make ends meet and help his mother, but he didn't lack an appetite for it. A notorious enforcer and cold strategist, and by the late 1950s, while Falcone was progressing in his studies, Riina already had a long list of bodies to his name and was fast developing a fearsome reputation. In 1961, Falcone, on his parallel life course to Riina, had just graduated with a rigorous law degree. Within 3 years, he was a judge, no surprise to anyone who knew how ambitious he was. He would spend the next 15 years as a local magistrate and in a few other roles, sometimes brushing up against Mafia activity but never directly confronting it. It would be years of working diligently, away from the spotlight before he faced his greatest enemy. Meanwhile, Riina was quite busy too. For La Belva, the 60s would be a bloody vendetta period. Once loyal to Michele Navarra, the powerful and respected boss of Corleone, Riina, along with his close allies Bernardo Provenzano and Luciano Leggio, had grown disillusioned with Navarra's leadership. Navarra, once a mentor, had become a target. His arrogance and refusal to share power left many of his underlings simmering with resentment. Riina and his partners saw an opportunity to seize control, believing Navarra's old-fashioned ways were holding them back from power and wealth that they sought. When Leggio finally made his move and had Navarra assassinated in 1958, it wasn't just a killing, it was a declaration of war. The bloody vendetta that followed was personal. Riina, Provenzano, and Leggio embarked on a ruthless campaign to wipe out every last supporter of Navarra, ensuring no remnants of the old guard could challenge their rise. By 1974, when Leggio was finally arrested, Riina seized the moment, stepping into the top spot he had been eyeing for years. The throne of Corleone was now his, and with it came the control he had always craved. Building the Corleone family's empire became his obsession. No one was safe from his thirst for power. Not prosecutors, not state representatives, no one. Attempts had been made to bring Riina and Corleone Mafia members to justice, including a 1969 trial for murder. But as had been tradition of the previous decades, charges were either brushed aside by a corrupt judge, or the defendant managed to get away between court and arrest. Riina and the Corleonesi had too many connections in high places. They knew the game well, and they played it better than anyone. They had politicians and judges in their pocket like so many nickels and dimes. Even on the run, Riina kept his operations running smoothly, hardly breaking a sweat. Riina killed his way to the top, and from there, he ruled as a dictator. Colonel Domenico di Petrillo. By the late 1970s, Riina and Falcone were on a collision course, but even though neither of them knew it yet, Riina's next moves would make sure of it. Toto Riina had pulled off plenty of audacious stunts before, but in the 80s? Well, that was when he cranked up the heat, blasting past the point of no return. May 1980. Police Captain Emanuele Basile, off-duty, walking with his young daughter, enjoying the quiet evening. Out of nowhere, shots ring out. Basile takes a bullet in the back. Blood stains the street. His daughter's scream pierces the air. Fast forward to 1982, Pio La Torre, a political thorn in the Mafia's side, is gunned down in his car. Glass shatters, bullets fly, and La Torre is left slumped in his seat. Then, just a few months later, a high-ranking police general sent to crush the Mafia is ambushed. Riina's message couldn't be clearer. Riina's targets got bolder, the hits more outrageous. Each assassination backed the government further into a corner. Sicilians, gripped by fear and anger, demanded action as news of yet another high-profile killing hit the airwaves. At the same time, some were claiming that the Mafia didn't have a structured form and so didn't exist. Yeah, right. Enter Giovanni Falcone. He just stepped into Palermo's prosecuting office, taking over from a boss who had been whacked by the Mafia. Talk about a welcoming committee. His new mission? Take down the Sicilian Mafia, starting with Riina and the Corleonesi family. Falcone wasn't just any prosecutor, he had a solid strategy, something he'd cooked up while dealing with bankruptcy cases, where it all came down to following the money. The Mafia might hide their crimes well, but money leaves an unavoidable trail. His office became a maze of paper, printouts of bank transactions piling up, the sound of rustling pages, the smell of ink. It was all part of the chase. And chase he did. Falcone's meticulous work revealed the Mafia's trafficking pipeline to the Gambino crime family in the US. Arrests followed on both sides of the Atlantic, shaking the underworld to its core. Riina should have seen the writing on the wall. Falcone wasn't just capable, he was relentless. This wasn't just a legal battle, this was personal. Falcone had grown up around these guys. Some of them were old playmates turned mobsters, and the streets he grew up in had been plagued by these criminals for too long. The stage was set for an epic showdown, and the stakes couldn't be higher. During this time, Falcone was soon reconnected with an old friend, Paolo Borsellino. They'd grown up in the same neighborhoods, played on the same streets, but now their paths crossed again, this time on the battlefield of justice. They were now on a mission. Borsellino, like Falcone, had pursued a legal career and found himself knee-deep in Mafia cases. The assassinations during this period were hitting close to home, none more so than the murder of his close friend, police captain Emanuele Basile. Again, this wasn't just work anymore, it was personal. Together they formed a formidable duo, soon gearing up for the Maxi trials. They had intelligence, skills, and most importantly, a burning desire for justice. But despite Falcone's relentless crackdown on Mafia finances, Riina was still quite unstoppable. It didn't deter him. He was interested in laying low like the bosses before him. He was a hurricane of violence, taking out anyone he saw as a threat, Mafia or not. Sicily was his empire, and he ruled with fear. For too long, he was untouchable. His hitmen lurked in the shadows, and Car became an all-too-familiar horror. The streets of Palermo echoed with uncertainty and the stench of danger. But similar to the rule of any tyrant, Riina's reign of terror was not going to last forever. The tides were turning, and soon one man would step forward and change Sicilian history forever. Back in '81, when the Second Mafia War was at its height, Stefano Bontate, the boss of the Santa Maria di Gesù crime family, was driving in his brand new Alfa Romeo back from his birthday party. Unfortunately for him, he would be the unwilling recipient of the first shots out of the newly acquired AK-47 in Sicily. Bontate was a rival of Riina, and so in his quest to become the Capo dei Capi, he saw it time to wipe out his rivals. Less than 3 weeks later, another Don. This time it was Salvatore Riina, who was another recipient of a hail of bullets from these newly acquired Kalashnikovs, ironically just before he was about to get into his new bulletproof Alfa Romeo. With them gone, Riina had wiped out the leadership of a rival faction. But as you're gonna start to notice, Riina's reckless brutality would come back to haunt him. You see, a key ally of both Bontate and Inzerillo was a man by the name of Tommaso Buscetta, a man who will change Sicilian history forever. Known as the boss of two worlds, Tommaso Buscetta wasn't just any mafioso, he was quite the pezzonovante. His resume is quite impressive. He was a founding member of the Sicilian Commission known as the Cupola. But why was he called the boss of two worlds, I hear you ask? Well, it was mainly because of his business interests on both sides of the Atlantic, with deep connection to Cosa Nostra in America. After serving 8 years for historic murders, he soon ended up moving to Brazil. So once chaos erupted in Sicily with the start of the Second Mafia War and the taking out of his close allies, Buscetta remained frustratingly out of reach for the increasingly merciless Riina. Even with most of his rivals taken out or on the run, Riina saw Buscetta as a massive threat. Riina was still quite paranoid and insecure in his power, and so made it his mission to have Buscetta succumb to his will. But with Buscetta far from his reach, he would need a bit more of an innovative approach compared to his regular strategy. Riina thought to himself, well, if I can't get to him, I'll make him come to me. To lure him out, he began with targeting everyone Buscetta held dear, starting with his sons, who were believed to have been disappeared, falling victim to Lupara Bianca, the white shotgun. Lupara refers to the traditional sawed-off shotgun used by Sicilian mafiosi for close-range executions, and Bianca, meaning white, chillingly signifies the clean erasure of any physical evidence. Victims of Lupara Bianca, often abducted, taken out, and disposed of in a way that leaves no trace, buried in a secret grave, dissolved in acid, or simply made to disappear, if you know what I mean. By leaving no trace behind, they don't allow for the families to have closure or mourn their loved ones properly. So this practice isn't just about eliminating a threat, it's a calculated move designed to instill fear and maintain control. Lupara Bianca serves as the ultimate punishment within the Mafia's ruthless hierarchy, often reserved for traitors or those who have severely crossed a powerful boss. It sends a clear, terrifying message. Cross me, and you won't just be taken out, you'll be erased. No body, no trial, no justice. Just a terrifying silence that serves as a warning to anyone else who might think about stepping out of line. And many of those close to Buscetta suffered this fate. Riina was hoping that this would infuriate Buscetta, creating with him a burning desire for revenge, where Buscetta would finally come out of hiding. But he wouldn't budge, so Riina doubled down again. In total, Riina would take out over 12 of Tommaso's family members. Most of them had nothing to do with Cosa Nostra. They were just regular people. Nevertheless, Buscetta did not make a move, no matter how alluring the bait was. But fate would have other plans for him.
Stabilire un contatto umano con un mafioso.
Certamente, sono uomini come tutti gli altri.
Che vuol dire Buscetta, per esempio?
Ma sono anche loro persone simpatiche, antipatiche, con un'anima nobile, con un'anima meno nobile, come tutti gli altri.
C'è tutta un'umanità.
C'è tutta un'umanità, certo.
Sao Paulo, Brazil, 1983. Picture this. Buscetta, holed up in a sleek high-rise, trying to convince himself that this life, this disguise, was enough to keep the wolves at bay. He thought he was safe, lost in the labyrinth of fake names, false identities, and forgotten promises. But safety is an illusion, especially when your enemies are as relentless as the truth. Then, it happened. The Brazilian police stormed in like a pack of wolves descending on wounded prey, guns drawn, eyes cold, ready for blood. It was like something out of a nightmare, the kind where you can't run, you can't hide, and can't wake up. Buscetta, the once untouchable capo, the man who had danced with death and lived to tell the tale, was now face down on the floor, wrists clamped in steel, his world shattering around him. Months later, he was extradited back to Italy. The man who had slipped through the fingers of death so many times was now staring down the one thing he couldn't escape: reality. The Mafia's long arm was reaching out from across the ocean, pulling him back to a world that had no mercy left for traitors. Italy was waiting. Extradition meant a death sentence, and Buscetta knew it. The Corleonesi knew it. Hell, everyone knew it. He was a man racked by depression and disillusionment, a shadow of the once feared capo who had navigated the dark alleys of power with ruthless precision. The walls of his cell felt like they were closing in, suffocating him under the weight of all the blood spilled, all the lives lost. In a moment of despair, he decided to end it all. But fate, perhaps in some twisted sense of justice, had other plans, and so his attempt failed. That failure became a turning point. With nothing left to lose, Buscetta made a choice that would shake the very foundations of the Mafia. The ultimate turning point in the history of Sicily as a whole. He decided to do what was once the unthinkable: collaborate with the state. Reaching out to the one man who could make it count, Judge Giovanni Falcone. There was something in Falcone that Buscetta recognized, a relentless commitment to the cause, a drive that mirrored his own past. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about a strange, mutual respect that had developed between two men on the opposite sides of the law. With that understanding, Buscetta became a pentito, a state collaborator, a role that would turn the tide in the war against the Mafia. The agreement was sealed, and with it, the next chapter of this deadly saga was ready to unfold. The man who had once thrived in the shadows was now about to shine a light on the darkest corners of the Cosa Nostra, and the ripples of his decision would be felt far beyond the walls of his cell. Being a prosecutor preparing for the largest case ever against a notorious criminal organization isn't just challenging, it's terrifying. You're up against a group that's willing to take anyone you hold dear without hesitation, a shadowy empire that's never been successfully dismantled. You've watched colleagues get taken out one by one, their deaths a grim reminder of the stakes involved. Even with the skill and tenacity of a man like Giovanni Falcone, it's a task that would make anyone think twice. But now, you're gifted a secret weapon, a man from the inside, someone who knows the Mafia like the back of his hand. Suddenly, you're not just building a case, you're crafting a strategy, one with the precision of a hunter setting traps. Falcone was handed something priceless, the intimate knowledge of his prey. For 45 days, he sat with Tommaso Buscetta, extracting every detail, every secret. Buscetta, a man broken by loss and despair, had held nothing back. After all, what did it matter if Riina had already marked him for death long before he ever thought of betraying the Mafia? With each passing day, Buscetta peeled back the layers of the Cosa Nostra, each word a bullet aimed at the heart of the Mafia. He revealed its inner workings, its structure, recruitment techniques, and the dark rituals that kept it so elusive for so long. Falcone would later say,
"Before him, we only had a superficial idea of the Mafia phenomenon. With him, we began to see inside the organization, the structure, the recruitment techniques, and the functions of Cosa Nostra."
Armed with this knowledge, Falcone and his team meticulously prepared for the Maxi trial set to begin in 1986. It was a historic moment, but as the preparations intensified, so did the threat. Salvatore Toto Riina, fresh off his bloody victory in the Second Mafia War, had finally begun to take Falcone and the state's efforts seriously. He knew that Buscetta's information had turned his enemies into a much sharper, more dangerous force. And in response, Riina did what he did best. He planned to fight back with a level of brazen violence that would leave the world reeling. His next move would be his most outrageous act to date. If you thought Riina couldn't sink any lower, well, think again.
The useless death of others, the unjust death of innocents, convinced me not to remain a mafioso. Buscetta.
On Sunday, December 23, 1984, the 904 express train was bustling with holiday cheer as it sped from Naples to Milan. The carriages were packed with passengers, families, travelers, all on their way home or heading to see loved ones for Christmas. The air was filled with the kind of warmth that only the holiday season can bring. But at 7:08 p.m., that warmth was shattered. A massive blast tore through the ninth carriage. It was so powerful that it echoed like a thunderclap in the tunnel the train was passing through. The timing was no accident. Riina had chosen this moment, this place, to maximize the devastation. 15 people lost their lives instantly. Another 267 were injured. Many of them left to claw their way out of the twisted wreckage. A truly horrifying scene. This wasn't just another attack, it was Riina's most sinister move yet. A truly devious act which he had hoped would divert state resources away from anti-mafia activity as they looked to extreme political groups as culprits. But as with many of his grand schemes, Riina underestimated his enemies. Falcone and his team continued to prepare diligently for the upcoming trial. Undeterred, they looked to utilize every piece of intel Buscetta had given them to sharpen their case for the Maxi trial. The blast may have shaken the nation, but it didn't shake their resolve. If anything, it steeled them as they prepared to use Buscetta's betrayal on the Mafia to its fullest, turning the tide in their relentless war against Cosa Nostra. The Maxi trial began in 1986 in a bunker-like setup right next to a prison. Even though Riina and the big bosses were still on the run, an unbelievable 475 other Mafia defendants were on trial, representing all levels of the organization. Nothing of this scale had been attempted before, and everyone felt the significance. There were 2 other judges appointed who acted as backups should anything happen to the main one. Whilst Buscetta was there also to witness proceedings, for nearly 2 years they grilled the Mafia defendants one by one. We're talking 120 murder charges plus extortion and other serious crimes. In the end, 338 out of 475 were convicted, totaling over 2,500 years of prison time. Life sentences in absentia were handed down to the higher-ups still on the run, like Provenzano and Riina. Now, you have to understand how significant this really was. This was more than just a few criminals being sent to jail. This was a crushing blow to the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, because it showed the world they were no longer invincible. With this, many mafiosi chose to cooperate and become state witnesses. Things were getting out of hand for Riina. Despite his huge success with the Maxi trial, for the next few years his fight against the mafiosi was held up in Sicily. Corrupt insiders, probably on the Mafia's payroll, made his job a nightmare. Meanwhile, Riina and his Corleonesi continued their reign of terror, ruling with an iron fist. They acted like the Maxi trials were just a bump in the road. So when Falcone transferred to Rome in 1991, you can imagine the Cosa Nostra bosses celebrating quite heavily, thinking that he was finally out of the picture. But, well, much to their dissatisfaction, Falcone wasn't done. From the capital, he overturned a previous judge's ruling, which had released some of the bosses convicted in the Maxi trial. He strengthened the state's anti-mafia efforts by creating district offices specifically to fight the Mafia. And he teamed up with the Swiss to track and seize the Mafia's hidden money over there. With his empire more vulnerable than ever, seeming on the brink of collapse and law enforcement swiftly closing in, Riina was now at a crossroad. Does he double down and let all hell break loose? Or bide his time and play the game more strategically, slowly fading back into the background and de-escalate the situation? Well, guess what option Riina went for? May 23, 1992. Falcone was returning to Palermo with his wife on one of his regular flights. They stepped off the plane, greeted by their waiting chauffeur and his security detail, a standard precaution for anyone in the judiciary fighting the Mafia. But in a bold move and sort of an act of defiance in the face of the Mafia, he insisted on driving himself from the airport to his home. His bodyguards followed in the other cars, and soon the convoy was on its way, heading out on the 829 highway. Falcone and his wife were relaxed. They were just half an hour into their journey when they were approaching the town of Kepci, where an elaborate trap had been sprung. A deafening blast ripped through the highway, a thunderous roar that could be heard miles away, even being detected as an earthquake. The ground beneath them heaved, sending massive circles of asphalt and concrete into the sky. The bodyguard's car leading the convoy was flung up and off the highway into an adjacent field. Overseeing this carnage was one of Riina's trusted men. He had radioed the detonation team as Falcone's convoy reached the carefully placed marker. This was no random act, but a meticulously prepared operation, orchestrated by Riina himself. They had packed over 400 kilograms of high explosives into a culvert beneath the motorway, planning this audacious attack for months. The execution was flawless. Falcone and his wife, alongside many of the entourage, would not make it. This was a national tragedy that shook the core of not just Sicily, but the Italian society as a whole, the effects of which would ripple across the world. Riina and his close associates toasted their grim success. La Belva had struck again, claiming his highest profile target yet. Falcone, an unyielding hero of the anti-mafia fight, was dead, and his steadfast ally Borsellino would soon follow. This was an incredibly dark time, but this is where Riina's short-sightedness would come back to haunt him. You see, like the tragic Train 904 incident, he exposed a key weakness of his. Sure, he excelled at raw violence, but playing the long game against the state, not so much. Taking out Falcone didn't remove the problem. Instead of putting out the fire in the hearts of those fighting for justice, he ignited it to levels that have not been seen before. Falcone was now a martyr, a symbol, someone who the people would rally behind and finally bring an end to this tyrant's reign. What Riina saw as a victory would soon end up haunting him forever. News of Falcone's death spread like wildfire. The world was already watching his epic fight against the Mafia, and many were well acquainted with his fearless deeds. In Italy, the reaction was immediate and intense, a nation mourning the loss of a prodigal son, a man who would soon be immortalized as a hero for giving his life in service to the state, a symbol of justice in the fight against tyrants. His funeral, broadcast on state TV, gripped the nation. But that grief quickly turned to anger, aimed squarely at the Italian government. How could they let this criminal group run wild? The list of murdered prosecutors and politicians was long, and it was clear to anyone paying attention that Sicily was slipping out of government control. If they couldn't even protect their top prosecutor, then what was the state good for? The backlash and global embarrassment sparked a fierce response from the Italian state. No longer could Falcone's warnings about a highly organized and central-controlled mafia be dismissed as paranoia. Anyone attempting to cover up the numerous crimes of these criminals were quickly exposed, no longer daring to risk being ousted as a puppet of the Mafia. Falcone's death was followed by Borsellino's brutal murder just months later.
Di essere ammazzato, Borsellino alla fine ci mise la certezza, cioè Borsellino era certo, e nonostante ciò.
Riina was doubling down on his failing strategy, believing he was more powerful than the state. This forced the government to act with a new sense of urgency. Police numbers were reinforced, and over 7,000 soldiers, 7,000, were deployed to Sicily. This would be the largest military presence on the island since World War II. The stage was set for the final hunt, targeting the man who had orchestrated all this chaos, Riina himself.
He's like an apple, red and beautiful, but inside is rotten and has worms.
Marchese, Riina's driver, referring to his boss. Riina had been on the run for years, but this time it was different. The state was determined, throwing everything they had at finding him. The resources committed were quite formidable. This wasn't like the old days in the 60s or 70s. The heat was real and it was intense. Riina had spent his life as the hunter, taking out his enemies no matter who, without a second thought. Now, he was the hunted one, a role he was not used to playing, and became a reality that surely irritated him. The Italian police had spent 5 grueling months locked in a surveillance operation to track down Riina. It wasn't just the logistics that made it difficult, it was the wall of silence that still surrounded him, a cloak of fear that kept Sicilian lips sealed. Respect had long since turned to fear. It was enough to keep people quiet. No one wanted to be the one to give up the La Belva. To make things even worse, the last photo they had of him was from 1969, a grainy relic that barely resembled the man they were hunting. But despite the challenges, he couldn't hide forever. And soon, they finally had a lead. January 15th, 1993, the police made their move. Riina, unaware that his time was up, casually exited a villa and got into a car with his driver. The officers tailed them closely, hearts pounding as they prepared for the takedown. The moment came fast. Police cut off the car, and a young officer, eager and unyielding, yanked open the passenger door. He grabbed Riina by the throat and slammed him onto the tarmac. The force, the shock, it was all over in seconds. How did they find him? Well, it was a fitting betrayal for a man who had spent his life steeped in treachery. The breakthrough came when two members of Riina's own family turned on him, feeding the police the final pieces of information. It led them to a villa where the operation finally zeroed in on this complex. The villa was placed under tight surveillance, with officers in an undercover van keeping tabs day and night, confirming his presence. There had been expectations of a struggle and a possible gunfight, a final bloody showdown, similar to that of Escobar. Riina, the once feared boss, had been living these last years as a ghost, avoiding detection. In this new role as an aging civilian, there was no fight left in him. Therefore, as the handcuffs clicked shut, Riina looked at the officers and, with a touch of that old arrogance, said, "Gentlemen, you're making a big mistake." But the mistake wasn't theirs. After decades of terror, the Italian state finally had their man. Toto Riina, the beast, was off the streets. Those who were afraid know that the monster is not invincible. Vincenzo Parisi, National Police Chief. Many Italians thought they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Riina's reign of terror wasn't over just yet. The months after his arrest saw a wave of blasts rip through Italy, more than just your typical mafia business. Some of these were petty revenge hits, but others were calculated warnings to the mafiosi that they should not dare think about collaborating with the state, even while the boss has been captured. It kicked off with an attack targeting a TV host who had the nerve to celebrate Riina's capture. From there, it escalated. Art galleries, churches, public spaces all became targets, leaving civilians wounded and many losing their lives. It was almost like Riina's final death throes were desperately trying to cling to power even from behind bars. He wasn't used to not getting what he wanted, and now he was drowning, so he did the only thing he knew how to do: unleash more violence. But Riina's arrest brought up some uncomfortable questions. How could he have been on the run since 1969, yet lived quite a luxurious life for most of his time on the run? The guy had a family, raised kids, got medical care, and lived openly in local communities, places where people definitely knew who he was. Sure, he used a fake identity, but considering how high a priority it was to catch him, the whole thing just didn't add up. The truth? His long evasion exposed the true power of the Corleonesi and the deep-rooted corruption within the government institutions. From law enforcement to the judiciary, local government, and beyond, the Mafia had many of them in their pockets like so many nickels and dimes. But it wasn't until Falcone and Borsellino were killed that the veil was finally lifted on this ugly reality. Soren Kierkegaard once said, "The tyrant dies and his rule is over. The martyr dies, and his rule begins." This sentiment echoes profoundly in the life and legacy of Giovanni Falcone, the judge who would define the legal fight against the Sicilian Mafia and become a symbol of courage and resistance. Riina hoped that, just like with his previous charges in 1969, the current ones would be swept under the rug with the help of the politicians and judges he had in his pocket. Confident in his influence, he even ordered the construction of a lavish villa in Corleone, so he could live out his retirement in style. But this time, he was dead wrong. There would be no corrupt judge to save him, no quiet life of luxury awaiting him. The trial was a spectacle, broadcast for the world to see. Riina was flown in by helicopter, surrounded by a heavy military and police presence. The state was trying to reclaim their prestige and rectify the damage to their reputation. The once feared Don, now an aging man with white hair, took to the stand. He tried to play the helpless victim. Take a look.
Io ho fatto solo l'agricoltore, contadino, lavorando onestamente. Io e la mia famiglia, cioè i miei genitori, i miei nonni, signor Presidente. Che non posso influenzare nessuna politica a Palermo perché non conosco nessun politico. nessun segretario dei politici, perché magari conoscesse un segretario, allora potrebbe pure influenzare tramite il segretario la politica, avvocato.
Ciancimino che di Corleone l'ha conosciuto?
Io non conosco Ciancimino perché Ciancimino è forse nata a Corleone, ma non è mai stato al paese a Corleone.
But no one was buying it. So he obviously proclaimed his innocence, playing out his life story, his humble beginnings and supposedly legitimate business interests. While he did suffer a tragic childhood, overall it was seen as a pathetic attempt to mask decades of brutality and murder.
All these years, no one looked for me. No one stopped me. No one said anything to me. I'm a poor illiterate, just a poor farmer. All home, work, family, and church, as they say in our parts.
Riina lamented in court, playing the role of a simple man who was misunderstood, but the facade was paper thin. He claimed ignorance of many of the turncoats testifying against him and flat out refused to acknowledge his old friend Tommaso Buscetta. He goes,
"I don't want to talk with this immoral man. He doesn't have my moral stature."
But Buscetta wasn't having it, firing back, "How could he talk about morality when he's responsible for the deaths of my loved ones, when he's killed so many people? Where's his morality? Riina, show it to me." Things were heating up. The Mafia were airing their dirty laundry for all the world to see. This would have been just as intense, if not more, than the OJ trials in America. Here are some of the most interesting moments.
Riina, non sono più solo io che parlo. Adesso è una marea. Mafia è finita.
Riina, lei può non rispondere, però se si diverte o partecipa alla corte perché si diverte o non si diverte più.
Io a 18 anni ho avuto una lite da ragazzi lì, una rissa, è successo che io sono stato ferito, è successo un omicidio e quindi me ne sono andato in carcere e aveva 18 anni. Mettete che sono bravo, che sono a disposizione, perché non ci scrivete questo? Che scrivo quello che è Salvatore Riina, non che si scrive mosse, che si scrive cose dei bambini. Salvatore Riina ha 4 bambini, adora i bambini e adora tutto e tutto. Interessato di gioca, perché se non è interessato non con me.
Petty and spiteful to the bitter end. Riina was slapped with 26 life sentences, no chance he'd ever see the light of day again. In the years that followed, he had to watch as the state snatched up over $120 million of his assets, including his precious Corleone mansion. And just to twist the knife, that mansion was turned into a police station, opening its doors in 2015. The ultimate middle finger to Riina, who died in prison 2 years later, in November 2017. The man who built this criminal empire to the heights never seen before, a man who for so many years was untouchable, La Belva, was now going to meet his maker, facing the ultimate justice. But even with the demise of this ruthless godfather, the story of the Sicilian Mafia does not end here. After Riina, other leaders stepped up to fill the void. There was Bagarella, a ruthless enforcer who held significant power until his arrest in 1995. Then came Provenzano, Riina's childhood friend from their days as farm laborers in Corleone. He managed to evade capture until 2006, thanks in part to his use of the Caesar code, a simple but effective encryption technique where each letter in a message is shifted a certain number of places in the alphabet. This code allowed him to keep his communications secure and stay one step ahead of the authorities. After Provenzano, Matteo Messina Denaro took the reins. He was from the next generation and remained the capo di tutti until his arrest in 2023. He's an interesting character who needs a video of his own. Comment below if that's something you want to see. Each of these men had their own style, but something they all realized and actually implemented was becoming more discreet compared to the previous era of brazen violence and terror campaigns. But following Riina's downfall, the power of the Sicilian Mafia and the Corleonesi clan was heavily restricted. The murder of Falcone had led to the removal of many corrupt law enforcement officers, a surge in army and police presence, and the passing of a law to protect pentiti, mafia informants. Crucially, tougher prison conditions were also enforced, making it much harder for mafia bosses to run their operations from behind bars. All of this meant the days of the Corleonese's clan's unchecked power, where they could execute hits and buy off politicians at will, pretty much came to an end. It was a slow process, but their influence quickly began to fade. Now look, this doesn't mean it became 100% crime-free. Some of the old rackets lived on. Construction industry kickbacks, extortion, gambling, and other areas of illicit activity continued on. But with the state constantly breathing down the Sicilian Mafia's necks, they had to adapt to a whole new game. At the same time, their famed adaptability and opportunism didn't wane. Like, for example, look what they did in 2019 when they had put the world on halt. While the world was in chaos, they saw an opportunity, ramping up loan sharking, and for those who were struggling and quietly taking over more businesses during that time of hardship. They've gone further underground, but they're still out there, lurking in the shadows, proving that this is one organization that's tough to wipe out for good. While many brave Sicilians still refuse to play by their rules, it's still no easy task. Today, the criminal landscape in Sicily and Italy as a whole has changed drastically. The crown has been passed on to the 'Ndrangheta and Camorra over in Napoli and Calabria, where they have taken things to a whole new level. Sure, the Cosa Nostra still exists in Sicily, with new recruits joining the ranks, but it's a shadow of its former self. Its power was crippled, and in its place, more decentralized criminal groups have sprung up and thrived. It's a pattern we've seen before, even in the US. When the government comes down hard on big organized crime syndicates, what often takes their place are smaller, more chaotic and decentralized groups spring up, and the cycle starts all over again. As Falcone himself pointed out, these other gangs are more prone to being scattered and infighting, whereas the Mafia's unique structure had allowed for a more top-down and unitary organization. Take the 'Ndrangheta, for example. It's mostly made up of tight-knit family clans bound by blood ties, each operating independently. But don't let that fool you. This isn't some lightweight operation. Listen to this. In 2013, estimates put the 'Ndrangheta's annual turnover, the total income they were making, at over 50 billion euros. These guys are right up there with the biggest multinational corporations. A US diplomat even suggested that their criminal activities accounted for a jaw-dropping 3% of Italy's entire GDP in 2010. And who knows how much it's grown since. As you can probably guess, this immense wealth didn't just come about from shaking down a few mom-and-pop shops. So while they may not have the same structure as the old-school Sicilian Mafia, organizations like the 'Ndrangheta are an even more serious force to be reckoned with. Through the actions of heroic figures like Falcone, Borsellino, and countless more picking up the torch, Sicily has undoubtedly become a safer and more peaceful place for its residents. Just look at the numbers. Murder rates dropped from 718 in 1991 to just 28 in 2019. The days of regular violence in Palermo, with broad daylight hits and bombs going off almost weekly during Riina's reign, are long gone. The Sicilian Mafia today is a smaller, more discreet operation. They're still in the game, running drugs and making money, but they're doing it in a way that's more palatable and sustainable from the state's perspective. Ironically, they've reverted to something closer to their roots, where operating under the radar was considered a sign of skill and class. But make no mistake, the brutal exploits of Riina are left in infamy, where they belong. Falcone's legacy, on the other hand, lives on. He remains a symbol of resistance in the face of overwhelming odds, and a reminder that courage can outlast even the darkest of times. The battle between the Mafia and the brave people of Sicily will continue on like it has for centuries.
E ovviamente continuiamo a dire non pagate il pizzo e andate dalle forze dell'ordine a denunciarmi.
I hope you enjoyed this documentary. It was really interesting to make, but with countless hours put into it, it was no easy task. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to like the video to let us know. Comment this below so we know that you made it to the end. listen closely. What I'm about to tell you is an offer you simply can't refuse. Joining the Sicilian Mafia never ends well for anyone involved. It's a crazy life built on exploitation and false promises. While they claim to live by honor and integrity, a closer look at their stories reveals a dark reality. Their lives are filled with danger, betrayal, and fear. No one truly wins in that world. But what if there was a different kind of mafia, one that offers a path to real power and success, one where you only benefit? Although, for a long time, this was too good to be true. Well, today, it's become a reality. This is exactly where the culture mafia comes in. You see, by being part of the culture mafia, you gain access to the timeless wisdom that's been hidden from you. By examining the philosophies and figures that we do, we can extract valuable lessons without falling into their destructive patterns. There's a lot to learn from their strategies, and we've done just that, transforming these powerful insights into tools for positive and easily attainable growth. That is the reality of those ambitious enough to join the culture mafia. So now, the question that should be on your mind is, how do I join? Well, for now, all you need to do is 3 things. Like the video, hit the notification bell to stay updated, and subscribe to ensure you never miss out on our invaluable content. And finally, comment Inner Circle so everyone can see where you stand. Make sure you're up to date with everything we do, and stay tuned for The Call to Get You Made. We've also launched our new membership feature here on YouTube. Just click the join button below and watch the introductory video that will give you everything you need to know. We truly appreciate all your support. If you've been tuning in for a while, you can attest to how we live by a strict code of honor. We rely on your support in order to continue and build and work towards our mission. So thank you.